It's a real pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Hal Brands is an associate professor of public policy and history at Duke University. He's also a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and he's previously worked at the Institute for Defense Analyses. And he served as a member to the RAND Corporation's Grand Strategy Advisory Board. Dr. Brands is a prolific writer. He's already authored 4 books on U.S. foreign policy, including his current book, which I learned is out. It is called Making the Unipolar Moment, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Rise of the Post-Cold War Order. And that is the subject of today's lecture. So with that, Dr. Brands.
All right, well, thank you, Aaron, for that introduction, and thanks to everybody for making time to come out today. It's a great privilege to have the opportunity to speak with you and to be a part of this speaker series. Dr. Mahan and her team over at the OSD Historical Office do a number of great things here, and hosting this speaker series is one of them. And so it's just great to be a part of that. And let me just emphasize at the outset, just purely for disclaimer reasons, that I'm speaking here purely in my personal capacity and not on behalf of anyone or anything bigger than that. So to get into the substance of what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk a bit about grand strategy lessons from the Cold War. And I think that's a timely subject because today, in 2016, American grand strategy has reached something of a crossroads. So since World War II, America has pursued what I would term an ambitious and deeply engaged grand strategy to shape the global order. And the precise contours of that strategy have changed from year to year, from presidential administration to administration, but I think that the core overarching principles have remained largely constant. Over 7 decades, we've sought to preserve and extend a prosperous and open world economy. We've sought to foster a peaceful international environment in which democracy can flourish. We've sought to prevent any hostile power from dominating one of the overseas regions that's crucial to our security and economic well-being, so Europe, East Asia, the Middle East. And in support of all this, we've undertaken what's really an extraordinary degree of international activism on issues ranging from democracy promotion to free trade to the promotion of geopolitical stability in key regions. And indeed, if there's been a single distinguishing, consistent mark of this strategy, it's been our alliance commitments in places like Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East, and then the forward presence, the troop deployments, the overall military power that we use to substantiate those commitments. And I think this really robust international activism has been the fundamental element of continuity in American grand strategy since World War II. It's been the backbone of a strategy to keep the world stable and congenial to our interests. And on the whole, I think it's fair to say that this strategy has been quite successful over time. It's underpinned an international system that by any meaningful historical comparison has been remarkably peaceful, prosperous, and democratic. But, and this is a more recent phenomenon, this grand strategy is now coming in for a challenge. It's come in for challenge within the academic strategic studies community, certainly. So a number of people that we consider leading lights within that community would argue that the U.S. should radically break with its post-war grand strategy and undertake a fairly dramatic geopolitical retrenchment. And if you simply read the newspaper or watch CNN today, you can see that this critique has to some degree gone mainstream. It's figuring prominently in our public and political debates today. And so calls for a significant pulling back from the world are louder and more widespread now than they have been at any time in the past 25 years, certainly since the end of the Cold War. And these calls for retrenchment often vary in their specifics, but they fundamentally agree on a number of basic propositions. That the United States can't afford such an ambitious grand strategy anymore. That our alliances and security commitments bring more costs than benefits. That our foreign policy causes more problems than it solves. And that the solution to all this is to adopt a much more austere approach to grand strategy, to get out of the democracy promotion business, for instance, to dramatically narrow the range of circumstances in which we might use force, to roll back the overseas alliance commitments and deployments that we've maintained for so long. And so these issues are no longer such fringe positions in the grand strategy debate. They're increasingly central to the debate. They're increasingly common to hear. And sometimes this strategy is called offshore balancing, sometimes it's called restraint. But the basic thrust of it is pretty much always that we can have an acceptable international order without a lot of the activism and the cost and the difficulty that we've had to bear as part of our long-standing grand strategy. And so essentially the idea is that when it comes to U.S. national security, less can actually be more. Doing less in the world can actually give us more security and in some cases more influence. And so the fundamental debate in U.S. grand strategy today is really between these rival schools of thought, sort of the first order debate, between what I call the legacy grand strategy on the one hand and the retrenchment school on the other. And this debate centers on a series of big strategic questions. Can the U.S. economy sustain the burdens of its global defense posture? Are U.S. alliances net benefits or detriments to American interests? Is the U.S. overseas presence stabilizing or destabilizing in its effects? How would an American military retrenchment affect geopolitical dynamics in key regions? Is the U.S. in inexorable decline? How you answer these questions generally determines where you come out with respect to what America's future course ought to be. But here's the hook for bringing history into this talk. Grand strategy isn't simply about the future. It's fundamentally about the past as well. Policy decisions are indelibly influenced by perceptions of what happened before and what we ought to learn from it. And this is generally a good thing because I think that history can shed light on some key questions of American policy. It can remind us of lessons that our predecessors learned at considerable expense. It can provide a sort of laboratory for testing propositions about American statecraft. It can basically lend the perspective of the past to contemporary strategic debates. And so grand strategy is inherently a prospective, forward-looking undertaking. But I think it generally works better when it's informed by a backward-looking, retrospective view as well. And so what I'm going to do here is to talk about how history can inform the current grand strategy debate by revisiting another fundamental period in American grand strategy, which is the Cold War. Understandings of the Cold War have always exerted a profound influence on perceptions of the era that followed. And this is shown by the simple fact that this period is still known as the post-Cold War era. We still define our present era by reference to what came before it. And this isn't particularly surprising. The Cold War may have ended a quarter century ago, but it still exists within the living memory of a lot of policymakers and academics. And so its lessons loom large in debates on American statecraft today. And then moreover, precisely because the Cold War ended a quarter century ago, we now have a vast body of history, of scholarship that can help us better understand that conflict and its lessons. And so what I'll do here is to explore briefly those lessons that seem most pertinent to the current grand strategic crossroads, to evaluating whether retrenchment or efforts at geopolitical renewal represent the best path forward for America. And I'll admit at the outset that this is unavoidably kind of a subjective exercise. Reasonable people could pick different lessons to draw from the Cold War. They could interpret the underlying history of the Cold War in different ways. They could probably interpret the policy implications that I draw from that history in varying ways. But I would argue that the interpretation that I'm going to offer is the most persuasive one. And even if you don't buy that and you want to argue with me, that's fine, because it's precisely that process of debate and argumentation that helps us sharpen our understanding of the past and the lessons that it has to offer. So what's the bottom line? What are the key points that come across from the 8 lessons that I'm going to discuss? I'll just offer 3 big takeaways at the outset. So the first point is that the lessons that I'm going to discuss here strongly suggest that calls for major retrenchment rest on weak historical foundations. And I think in a lot of ways they actually underscore just how powerful the logic of America's legacy strategy actually is. So that's the first point. But here's a second point, Cold War history also teaches us that a dose of restraint and even some selective retrenchment from time to time can be very useful in ensuring the long-term health of an ambitious grand strategy. And then above all, and here's my third point, these lessons show us that the well-informed use of history can very much enrich the strategic debate today, just as the use of history enriched American grand strategy during the Cold War. So with all that as preface, let me get into the lessons themselves. So lesson 1 is that national power rests on economic foundations, but the economic case for retrenchment rests on weak foundations. So what do I mean by that? Well, grand strategy begins and ends with microeconomics. with macroeconomics. And I think the central insight from the Cold War is that geopolitical success is a function of economic vitality. After all, it was the West's superior economic performance that eventually exerted such a powerful magnetic draw on countries in both the Third and the Second Worlds. And perhaps more importantly, it was that superior performance that allowed the United States and its allies to maintain a long global competition that ultimately bankrupted Moscow in the end. And so I think in this sense, the Cold War's key takeaway is that preserving a vibrant free market economy as the source of both American hard and soft power is the most crucial task that we face going forward. And I think this lesson is pretty well understood today. But what's more problematic is the corollary that advocates of retrenchment often draw from this lesson. That the United States has to now slash its foreign commitments because those commitments are so expensive, so onerous, that they imperil long-term U.S. economic and fiscal health. And this argument is sort of superficially attractive, but if you look closer, I think it's actually quite flawed. Because for one thing, it elides the fact that U.S. deficits are fundamentally driven far more by exploding entitlement costs than by defense outlays. So as of 2014-2015, about 50% and rising of federal spending went to entitlements, and it was only about 18% and falling that went to defense. And then just as important, this argument ignores what I consider the inconvenient historical truth that during the Cold War, the United States sustained a far higher defense burden than it has today, while still maintaining robust growth for most of the post-war period. So in the 1950s, for instance, we spent over 10% of GDP on defense quite regularly. In the 1980s, it was often upwards of 6%. Since the mid-1990s, it's generally been between about 3 and 4% of GDP. And so when you put all this together, the relevant Cold War lesson here is that, yes, economic performance is indeed the font of national power, but that the U.S. economy has historically been capable of supporting a far higher defense burden without compromising that performance. Now, whether this remains true in the future, of course, is going to depend on the country's willingness to make hard choices associated with rationalizing U.S. tax and entitlement policy and addressing government deficits in a reasonable way. But if we take the Cold War as a guide, I think it reminds us that current defense spending actually constitutes a rather modest strain on the economy by historical standards, and that the United States could comfortably spend much more on defense were it willing to make those hard choices in intelligent ways. So that's the first lesson. A second lesson is that American engagement is the bedrock of international stability. So one of the key debating points regarding U.S. strategy today is this question of what all this defense spending and global engagement actually buys in terms of securing the international order. So does U.S. engagement foster stability and peace, as proponents of the legacy strategy would claim? Or does it basically invite blowback and other undesirable behavior, which is what the advocates of retrenchment would say? I think the history of the Cold War lends some support to both arguments, but the balance lies overwhelmingly with the latter perspective. So remember, U.S. global engagement during the Cold War was a response to the fact that the absence of such engagement had helped cause catastrophic instability during the interwar era. And during the Cold War, it was precisely the U.S. decision to embrace the responsibility of organizing and protecting the non-communist world that allowed regions like Europe and East Asia to break free from their pasts and achieve remarkable levels of stability. U.S. policy helped deter Soviet aggression and dissuade other disruptive behavior. It helped mute historical frictions between countries like Germany and Japan on the one hand and their former enemies on the other. It helped foster the climate of security in which unprecedented economic growth and multilateral cooperation could occur. U.S. policy certainly wasn't the only factor in these achievements, but it was the common thread that connected them. Now, the obvious question is what relevance this history has for grand strategic debates in a period that seems so different than the Cold War. And I think the relevance is simply this, to remind us that stability and all the good stuff that stability makes possible isn't an organic condition of the international environment. It's something that has to be provided by powerful actors who are willing to confront those forces, national rivalry, aggression by the strong against the weak, that have historically so often pushed international relations towards instability and conflict. And at a time when many of those forces again seem to be rearing their heads in places from East Asia to Eastern Europe, when there's certainly still no compelling candidate to replace Washington as the primary provider of international stability, this lesson is especially salient. So that's a second point. A third lesson is that the costs of U.S. alliances are real, but the benefits are enormous. So if you listened just to retrenchment advocates, you might think that our alliance commitments are the root of all evil, that they do nothing to advance our interests while encouraging free riding and reckless driving and all sorts of other bad behavior by our selfish allies. And these aren't particularly new concerns. During the Cold War, we continually worried whether U.S. allies were doing enough to provide for the common defense. We worried whether some of our particularly troublesome partners, like Chiang Kai-shek, might actually drag us into conflicts that we would prefer to avoid. And so in this sense, the history of the Cold War, it confirms that the burdens and the potential dangers associated with U.S. alliance commitments they're real enough. But I think what the history of the Cold War also confirms is the tremendous and irreplaceable value that U.S. alliances bring. So just think of all the benefits we got from our alliances during the Cold War. Our alliances provided the high degree of military interoperability that came from continual joint training. They provided the ability to call on U.S. allies to support our own military interventions in places like the Korean War. They helped lock in positive relationships with key geopolitical players like West Germany and Japan. They gave us forums and institutions for projecting our influence into key regions. They provided the moral legitimacy associated with being the leader of the free world. They provided us with bargaining advantages in trade and financial negotiations with our allies because we could use the fact that we were helping to provide their security as bargaining chips. Our alliances gave us the security leverage that we needed to prevent countries like West Germany and South Korea from developing nuclear weapons and thereby destabilizing entire regions. And then finally, and despite all the fears of entrapment, our alliances frequently gave us the influence we needed to exert a restraining effect on the behavior of worrisome partners. And so the fundamental historical lesson here is that alliances have never been a matter of charity in U.S. strategy. They've been a matter of enlightened self-interest because protecting others gives us enormous influence and advantages. I think the history of the Cold War reminds us of this fact. And so in doing so, it also reminds us that the burden of proof in the current debate shouldn't be on those who advocate maintaining these arrangements. It should be on those who would weaken or terminate them and thus risk forfeiting the benefits they've historically conferred. So that's a third lesson. A fourth lesson is that democracy promotion is not a distraction from geopolitics. So the advocates of retrenchment usually come from the high church of academic realism. And so they argue that the long-standing U.S. emphasis on spreading democracy is really just a distraction, and sometimes an explosively counterproductive distraction from the core mission of advancing concrete American interests. They are certainly right to note that there have been cases of democracy promotion gone horribly wrong, and there are instances from the Cold War, think back to Iran or Nicaragua during the late 1970s, that show how badly an overeager or ill-timed effort to promote liberal values can backfire. But I think the bigger lesson here is that the Cold War also shows that encouraging the spread of democracy is actually fundamental to achieving U.S. geopolitical goals and to increasing the nation's influence overseas. And I say this for two particular reasons. So first, and most broadly speaking, Cold War history reminds us of the simple fact that America's closest and most reliable allies have long been democracies. And so the spread of liberal values increases the range of countries with which we can build such deep and productive ties. And then second, and more specifically, I think Cold War history shows that the advance of democracy can provide big advantages in a prolonged geopolitical competition with an authoritarian rival. So from the late 70s onward, for instance, both the Carter and Reagan administrations understood that democratic institutions could provide the legitimacy that would make U.S. partners more stable and more reliable in such a competition. And I think these administrations also understood that the spread of liberal values could foster a broader global ideological climate in which a democratic great power, such as the United States, would be far more comfortable and influential than an authoritarian competitor like the Soviet Union. And as much as anything else, in fact, it was the global turn toward democracy from the mid-1970s onward, something that was often assisted by U.S. policy that showed just how much U.S. global influence was increasing and how much Soviet global influence was retracting in the last years of the Cold War. Now, I don't mean to say that the proper lesson from this is that democracy should be pursued in all quarters and all conditions, because the Cold War also certainly underscores the value of partnerships, even very uncomfortable ones, with authoritarian countries from China to Saudi Arabia. The lesson here is just that a grand strategy that emphasizes selective and strategic democracy promotion is likely to bring geopolitical rewards, and that a grand strategy that de-emphasizes those activities will lose a great deal in the bargain. So that's a fourth lesson. The fifth lesson is that the military balance shapes risk-taking and decision-making. So one of the big questions today is how a significant reduction of U.S. military power, which is something that's often envisioned by advocates of retrenchment, how that would impact decision-making and geopolitical alignments in the world's key theaters. This is a central question in considering U.S. strategy today, and I think based on the Cold War experience, the answer is not particularly comforting. Cold War history shows that the military balance isn't everything, but it also shows that significant shifts in that balance can have important effects on how states behave. So let me just give you a few brief examples of this. We now know, for instance, that the major shifts in the military balance that occurred from the late 40s through the mid-50s quite profoundly affected the level of risk that both U.S. and Soviet policymakers were willing to run in places from Korea to Berlin. In the early 1970s, we know that the massive growth of Soviet military power was one of the key factors in pushing West Germany to pursue closer relations with Moscow rather, as a way of purchasing some safety in the face of a changing strategic balance. That same military buildup seems to have played a role in encouraging more assertive Soviet behavior in Third World conflicts during the late 1970s. And then finally, in the 1980s, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Carter-Reagan buildup played a big role in convincing Soviet decision-makers like Mikhail Gorbachev to start winding down the Cold War. And the common thread here is that as military balances shifted, perceptions of opportunity or danger also shifted. And so the corresponding propensities for risk-taking or accommodation shifted as well. Now, there are obvious differences between the Cold War and today's world, but I think these examples are worth keeping in mind when considering what the consequences of large-scale retrenchment might be. Because what they suggest is that if U.S. retrenchment significantly altered the existing balance in key regions like East Asia, it might invite behavioral changes, whether by allies or by adversaries, that would run counter to the favorable climate that our military dominance has traditionally afforded in those regions. So when military balances start shifting dramatically, you should expect some nasty results. That's the fifth lesson. A sixth lesson is that dramatic retrenchment may be unwise, but restraint and selective retrenchment have their virtues. So from everything I've said so far, the Cold War's history suggests that we should be skeptical of calls for dramatic retrenchment. But I think there's an important caveat here, which is that Cold War history also tells us that a degree of grand strategic restraint is essential, and that selective retrenchment or recalibration at the margins can actually be quite a productive thing. And so let me break that down into two related subpoints. So first, Cold War history shows that activism has to be balanced with prudence in order to keep an engaged global strategy viable. So there were certainly times during the Cold War when the United States overreached in its efforts to contain communism, the commitment of 500,000 U.S. troops to Vietnam being the foremost example. And that overreach, particularly in the case of Vietnam, ultimately boomeranged so badly that it undercut domestic support for the broader U.S. global agenda. And so just as the blowback from Iraq has more recently given voice to calls for large-scale retrenchment, I think the insight from Vietnam is that activism has to be calibrated if it is to be enduring. So that's the first point. The second point is that Cold War history underscores that retrenchment at the margins rather than at the core of American strategy can actually be quite useful. So as a for instance, periods of military belt-tightening during the Cold War often forced U.S. policymakers to better define priorities and think strategically about how to accomplish core objectives. And those periods of belt-tightening also incentivized strategic innovation that helped us exploit comparative advantages and sustain our commitments at lower costs. So the offset strategy in the 1970s was born in a climate of budgetary austerity, and it emphasized high-tech capabilities that proved crucial not just to meeting the Soviet threat, but to giving the United States unmatched conventional dominance after the Cold War. And then more broadly, the selective retrenchment that happened after Vietnam allowed us to retreat from overextended positions that could only be held at an unacceptable price. It helped us reset our strategic bearings, and it ultimately helped us forge a more sustainable and effective approach to competing with the Soviet bloc. Now, just to be clear, selective retrenchment is itself quite hard to calibrate, which is something that the U.S. experience after Vietnam also demonstrates. And it can obviously bring dangers if it's taken too far. But if the overall goal is to preserve and strengthen a grand strategy of global engagement, then I think restraint and occasional tactical retrenchment can serve an essential purpose. So that's a nuance that's important to appreciate in thinking about the lessons of the Cold War. A seventh lesson is don't underestimate American resilience. So at their root, the prospects hinge on another key question in the grand strategy debate, the question of whether America is experiencing inexorable geopolitical decline. And proponents of retrenchment usually answer this question in the affirmative. And I think the past decade has, in fact, seen an erosion of our relative margin of international primacy. But the relevant lesson here is that U.S. power has often proved more resilient than predicted. So just as there is widespread discussion of U.S. decline today, America experienced repeated waves of declinism during the Cold War. After the Soviet A-bomb test in 1949, after the launching of Sputnik in 1957, after the oil shocks or the end of the Vietnam War in the 1970s, it was pretty widely assumed that U.S. power was steadily draining away. But in each case, these predictions turned out to be wrong. They were wrong because they attributed too much importance to near-term setbacks whose impact ultimately proved transitory, like the U.S. defeat in Vietnam, and because they attributed too little importance to the much deeper systemic weaknesses of adversaries like the Soviet Union. They were wrong because they underestimated the resilience of the U.S. economy and political system, and because they underestimated the enduring global appeal of America's liberal ideals. And just as important, these predictions were wrong because they missed the fact that the fear of decline actually pushed U.S. policymakers to take actions that facilitated American resurgence. So things like addressing budget deficits or restoring U.S. military advantages over Moscow during the 1980s. And so as a result of this, America actually came out of the Cold War not in decline, but stronger, at least in relative terms, than at any time before. Now, this history shouldn't inspire complacency about America's current trajectory, because I think the challenges that we face to U.S. primacy today are more formidable than at any time in the past quarter century. That's true of things like sluggish economic growth at home. It's true of things like the rise of China, the return of a more aggressive and revisionist Russia overseas. But the key point is that this history shouldn't inspire fatalism either. Because when we look back at the Cold War, it can help alert us to the fact that our current competitors, countries like Russia, Iran, China, they face domestic and international problems that make ours look modest by comparison. Looking back at the Cold War can remind us that we have a choice in the matter of decline, that there are domestic and foreign policies we can pursue that will either bolster or erode our relative power. And then above all, looking back at the Cold War can caution us against making potentially irrevocable grand strategic changes based on a hasty and what might turn out to be inaccurate reading of global trends. This is what Robert Kagan has called committing preemptive superpower suicide out of a misplaced fear of declining power. And so in sum, Cold War history, it certainly won't solve the problems that the United States faces today, but I think it does show that we've rebounded from situations that looked worse before. And this brings me to the eighth and final lesson, which is that America is capable of using history well. And the reason I mention this is because this isn't what you would necessarily expect from reading the scholarly literature. Most historians think that policymakers rarely use history well. And so historical accounts of the Cold War usually emphasize the misuses of history by U.S. policymakers in places like Vietnam. Now, I'll admit that U.S. officials didn't always use historical analogies and insights as effectively as they might have during the Cold War. But I would argue that on the whole, America's Cold War grand strategy actually represented a near textbook case of history used well. And the history in question, as I talked about a little bit before, was the history of the international system and American isolationism in the period prior to World War II. And the policymakers of the late 1940s and after learned several invaluable lessons from this period. They learned that economic depression led to extremism and war, and that the combination of great power and totalitarian government was very dangerous. They learned that U.S. security required maintaining a favorable balance of power overseas, and that the best way of avoiding another global war was through strength, multilateralism, and engagement, not through non-entanglement and withdrawal. These lessons may have been distorted, they may have been applied inappropriately at times, but in general they informed a post-war strategy that was spectacularly successful, and that shaped the broadly favorable international environment that we still inhabit today. And this learning process is important for two reasons. First, I think it stands as a useful corrective to the sort of common academic conceit that policymakers almost always use history poorly. And second, and more importantly, I think it gives cause for optimism about debates on U.S. grand strategy today. What I've argued here is that the history of the Cold War is just full of important insights that can help us assess grand strategic options and alternatives. And I would say that if the policymakers of today and tomorrow can draw on those insights as successfully as their predecessors did, they'll be better equipped to chart the nation's course. Because while only a fool would make policy solely on the basis of history, I think it would be equally foolish to ignore what lessons history has to offer. Thank you very much. Sure, yeah, happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much for the talk. Can I return to your second point? Stability is provided by great powers, but great powers also inject tremendous instability to the system. The U.S. was interested in stability during the Cold War when the alternative was Soviet expansion. Are we, and should we be, interested in stability following your fourth lesson of democracy motion when the alternative is an expansion of the liberal regime?
So, you're right to point out that certain of these insights do stand in a degree of tension with one another, right? This is kind of the way that the geopolitics works. But on the whole, these two things are not necessarily fatally contradictory to one another, right? Because in the long-term sense, the guiding American presumption, which I think is basically correct, is that over the long term, a more democratic world will be a more stable world, even if it leads to instability and disruption in the near term. The second thing to keep in mind is that promoting democracy is always tempered by other geopolitical concerns, right? So if you're thinking about sort of an effective approach to democracy promotion, it would presumably be one that takes into account factors like how political change will affect the broader climate in a region, whether there is a well-formed moderate alternative to an authoritarian regime and things like that, right? If you're not paying attention to those factors, then you can very easily get in a situation where democracy promotion leads to greater instability rather than stability. But I think if you keep in mind sort of the overarching idea that a more stable international system is a more prosperous international system, is a better one for our interests, you can promote democracy selectively within that context without necessarily destabilizing the system as a whole. Yes, sir.
Sir, in the Cold War, the economic system for the United States was generally wrapped up in the same with its own allies that it was protecting. And I think one difference here, how do you reconcile or see the opportunities or tensions, as you put it now, with trying to promote democracy in a globalized economy where we are much more, involved with China or looking at Russia?
I think that the tension there comes less with respect to democracy promotion than it does simply with other aspects of alliance maintenance. So one of the challenges we face today is that many of our allies and partners in the Asia Pacific are deeply embedded economically in a regional system with China, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's something we've actually promoted, but it does create some tensions. It creates some difficulties with respect to broader geopolitical issues. With respect to sort of the relationship between democracy and globalization, I think there is a fair degree of consensus that these things mostly move in the same direction. Right? And that's eliding a lot of complexity. But the general idea, which I think is backed up by a fair amount of social science research, is that in the long run, countries that are more open politically are more likely to be open economically and vice versa. And so I'm not sure that there's necessarily, again, a fatal strategic tension between those two things. Yes, sir.
So, excellent talk. And I would have thought one of the other lessons learned from the Cold War was, as Kissinger stated in diplomacy and his take on China, was the leverage of my enemy's enemy is my friend, and how we played China against the Soviet Union, and how we're actually, in my opinion, playing Vietnam against China right now. Could you comment on that, please?
I think that's a perfectly valid lesson to draw. I mean, I think that the lesson there is that perhaps a way of framing it more broadly is that it's important to keep in mind what the ultimate evil is, or what the ultimate goal you are pursuing is, right? And to be willing to make accommodations to lesser evils within that context, right? So the United States had no particular love for China's domestic political system in the 1960s and 1970s, but what Kissinger and Nixon and others realized was that if the fundamental goal was preventing Soviet hegemony in Eurasia, then this was sort of a sacrifice worth making in order to strengthen the core of the international order. And I think that's a very valuable lesson to keep in mind today, right? You can't optimize on all dimensions at once. You have to make trade-offs somewhere. And so whether that's in dealing with a country like Vietnam, with which we have increasing geopolitical ties, but we have some disagreements about domestic governance, whether it's in dealing with Burma or other countries like that, I think it's absolutely a valid lesson to keep in mind. So I'll happily take that as a friendly amendment to the talk. Yes, sir.
So what is winning? How would we know if our grand strategy was achieving success? I think you just said we would expect to see the world becoming more democratized. We would expect to see the flourishing of free markets. As countries become liberalized and their economies flourish, they become stronger. You also said the world becomes more stable. I agree. That being said, does that not reduce the requirement for unipolar hegemonic stability imposition because it's now emergent in the global system at large? Are we not trying to work ourselves out of a job?
That's a great way of putting it, and I think ultimately we would love nothing more than to work ourselves out of a job, to succeed ourselves out of a job. I'm confident enough that we are far enough away from that at present that we don't have to worry about going out of a job anytime soon. And in fact, one of the more troubling developments over the past 10 years is that we've seen, I think, an erosion of some of the good things that came about as a result of the end of the Cold War. We've seen a modest erosion of democratic governance around the world. We have seen modest decreases in stability in places like East Asia and Eastern Europe, sometimes more than modest decreases. And so I think that the tricky part about evaluating success from the perspective of American strategy is that it's partially represented by things that do happen. More economic liberalism, more political liberalism. But it's also fundamentally represented by things that don't happen. Great power war, catastrophic instability, right? And so when your marker of success is things that don't happen, it can be hard to put a metric on that. It can be hard to explain why we're doing this stuff in the first place. And so I think one of the challenges that we face today isn't necessarily in the idea that we're going to succeed ourselves out of business, but it's sort of articulating why we do this stuff in the first place, why it's been so useful over time, and as you say, what success looks like. Yes, sir.
Sure. One of the major underpinnings of our entire stability is the support of the populations of the governments and the actions that are taken. And corruption across government and politics is probably one of the greatest detriments we have for what's going on, at least in my opinion, today. How do you think this can be best handled?
I'm not sure I understood the question. You say correction in politics is one of the...
Corruption.
Oh, corruption in our politics.
In the world's politics.
In the world's politics, yeah. I think the short answer is that combating corruption is part of a general program of promoting good liberal governance overseas. And yes, there are significant challenges that we face in corruption in a place like Ukraine, for instance. Corruption is probably the second biggest threat other than Russian coercion to the survival of Ukraine as a state and the Ukrainian government. And so I wouldn't disagree at all with the premise that it has to be an important part of this. Now, the trick you run into with dealing with issues of governance, whether governance corruption, whether in places like Afghanistan or in Ukraine or elsewhere, is that, again, as I said, not all good things come at once. Right? And so there are times when we have to do some hard choosing about what priority we place on combating corruption as opposed to strengthening the security services of a friendly state or something like that. And so I think it is one of these things that's sort of constantly up for debate as to how much priority we should put on it. It's constantly in tension with other goals, and you can never resolve or ignore that tension completely, so you just sort of have to manage it as time goes on. Yes, sir.
Earlier you mentioned the example of Nixon going to China, and then kind of trade-offs as to like what our broader goals are as we engage with then with communist China. How would you apply that lesson to, say, Iraq and Syria, where everybody, including our adversaries, agree that the Islamic State must go, but then even amongst our own allies, there's serious disagreement as like, what's next?
So are you asking me what we should do in Iraq and Syria?
You have that answer, but how would you apply like maybe that lesson? Say, what would be should we solve the immediate problem and then deal with it?
I mean, I
later?
think the lesson is that you don't have the luxury of choosing to just deal with the short-term or the long-term piece of this, right? I mean, you can't make short-term victory enduring without addressing the longer-term political and ideological conditions that led to ISIL's rise. And there's plenty of cases you can look at during the Cold War that would reinforce that lesson, whether it's dealing with insurgencies in Latin America or others. The other lesson, I mean, the other point, though, is that you never get to the long term unless you achieve the short-term military victory. And so, I think this is what we're trying to do in Iraq, particularly right now, which is sort of win the near fight, win the military piece of this, while also working very hard on issues of corruption, on issues of governance, on issues of political inclusion. I don't know that the history of the Cold War yields sort of a magic bullet for how you do this. I'll simply say that I think perhaps one insight is that it's much more likely to happen with intensive American engagement, with intensive international engagement to strengthen the hand of people who, from our perspective, want to do the right thing than it is to happen without those things. Yes, sir.
Cold War, there was bipartisan agreement about our goals. That doesn't seem to be the case now. How would you go back to rebuilding this bipartisan agreement?
So I'm a little bit of a heretic when it comes to the question of sort of the golden age of American bipartisanship. And I think if you look closely at the history of the Cold War, the era of bipartisanship lasted about 2 years, from 1947 to 1949. And after that, there were vicious debates about everything from whether the State Department was infested with communist traitors, to whether we should prioritize Europe versus Asia, to whether we should be willing to fight counterinsurgencies in Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. And I think there's a tendency for us to look back on the past with rose-colored glasses and to sort of take the aphorism that politics must end at the water's edge as a statement of fact rather than a statement of aspiration. I think if you look carefully, I think you would see that the political debates then were just as venomous, they were just as rancorous as anything we have today. And so maybe the lesson here is that this actually gives me optimism that while I certainly don't like the state of political polarization in the country today, I'm not sure that it is so dramatically worse during the Cold War that it makes an effective grand strategy impossible to do. It certainly imposes challenges. It imposes challenges when it comes to the defense budget and lots of other things. But if you're just looking from a historical perspective, I think the drop-off in bipartisanship after the end of the Cold War is less severe than we often think it was. Yes, I'm sorry. This gentleman in front of you, please.
But if we could go on a tangent with that economically a little bit, because I think you'd still look back on history and you'd say, even though purely for political non-election reasons, but a more democratically controlled Congress, regardless who the president was, at the end, military spending was maintained at higher levels through Reagan before we start to go down. So there was at least some guiding goal of this is worth devoting our resources towards, versus in the beginning of your talk, you pointed out, hey, the entitlements, how far or what is the spectrum of your analysis where you're like, we're going so far on entitlements that regardless if everybody suddenly thought this was a great idea, we can't build up our military hardware and continue a Cold War deterrence posture?
So one of, just as preface, and then I'll get to the meat of your question, one of the reasons why defense spending as a percentage of GDP could come down after the end of the Cold War was that we didn't need a Cold War-sized military anymore. And so that was more of a function of geopolitical permissiveness than political dysfunction. I think, if you want me to put a really sharp point on it, I think that our current grand strategy is sustainable at 4% of GDP as a percentage of military spending. I'm not sure that it's sustainable at 3% of GDP. Yes, sir.
It strikes me that one interpretation of our Cold War strategy was that, in a sense, it could afford to be very risk-averse in terms of seeing the Soviet Union as an existential threat. An advancement by them would be a direct threat to our national security if they advance somewhere in the world. It's very hard today to find existential threats to U.S. national security in a similar way. So I was interested in hearing if you have any thoughts as to how we evaluate risk or threats, essentially, in an environment where it's hard to unify around an existential threat or gain that common perception of threat.
You know, most of the things that the Soviets did that we objected to during the Cold War did not in and of themselves represent existential threats, right? There was always the prospect of nuclear war, which is the most existential threat one could face. But the question of who controlled West Berlin was in no way existential. The question of who controlled Southeast Asia was not existential for us. What we learned, the reason we worried about these things is that we had learned during World War II that it was extremely dangerous for a hostile country to essentially have dominance of any of the three regions that make up sort of the core of Eurasia, right? Europe, East Asia, the Middle East. And so that was really how that was the lens through which we interpreted that, along with things like credibility, the Soviet advances in one of those theaters. And I think that, look, obviously the Soviet threat is gone, but I think that we still use that framework in a lot of ways to assess threats today, right? We worry about Russian aggression in Eastern Europe because it could undercut the stability of a region that we care very deeply about. We worry about it because it could undercut the cohesion of an alliance that has helped preserve stability in that region for a long time. We worry about what China is doing in the South China Sea and elsewhere because it could pose over the long term a threat to the balance of power in East Asia. And so it's not necessarily an issue of identifying existential threats. It's an issue, because thankfully we face very few of those, it's an issue of identifying those threats that could disrupt the international environment to which we have become accustomed to in a significant way. Now that's not necessarily a hard and fast standard. There's lots of room for interpretation. And in fact, most of the debates in U.S. foreign policy today are precisely about how much disruption can we withstand, right? You can look at the debate over Ukraine in this light. But I think that's the general standard we've used for 70 years, and I think it remains a fairly good standard. Yes, sir.
You talked about economic power being a linchpin of our overall national power. And then we talk about the value of liberalism and democracy in the world. And I think the corollary to that is that leads to better governance, economic growth, and those types of things, which are all positives of the strategy. But part of that is that you're taking parts of the world that, on a relative power basis, were significantly weaker because they didn't have those benefits. They take those on, they now have the benefits of better economy, better governance. And now the relative power of the United States compared to the rest of the world starts to look like it's diminished, even though in real terms it's increasing based on trade. And then you go to the populism within the United States itself, where people are looking at losing their jobs to economic opportunities going overseas and what they traditionally have done. So I guess my question is the problem with the strategy at this point that it's the victim of its own success?
Yeah, you know, to some degree that's probably true. If you look at sort of the shares of global GDP, global military spending since the end of the Cold War, there has been a bit of a shift away from the level of dominance that we had, say, in the mid-1990s to where we are today, and it's largely accounted for by the explosive growth and military buildup of a country like China, right? And so this is absolutely a case where we worked very hard to integrate China into this international order on the assumption that as China became more prosperous, it would become more liberal, it would become more integrated into the order and have less reason to disrupt it. The question we're facing now is, is this still a good bet or not? And I think the answer is we've gone so far, we're just going to kind of have to see at this point. Now, I would say that the future isn't all bleak, though, because if you look at sort of where there's been dynamism in economic growth and military spending, it's certainly not just in countries that are rivals or potential rivals of the United States. It's also in places like India. It's also in a lot of Asian nations that aren't treaty allies, but share a lot of our general geopolitical goals. And so our strategy has always been a coalition strategy. It's always been about rounding up countries that shared our basic interests and working together towards common goals. And so if you think that that's going to continue to be true, then I think the prospects for doing that and having a fairly vibrant coalition on our side are still fairly good. Sir.
Currently, America tries to make the case for global warming and climate change as a potential existential threat to the global international order. And what lessons from the Cold War for trying to get international agreement and global cooperation in this issue can we draw?
That's a good question. To be honest, I know very little about global warming, and I've thought relatively little about this. But I would say that it's not just the history of the Cold War that's relevant here. It's just the history of international relations more broadly, right? Which is that dealing with global warming is kind of the classic collective action problem. And these problems are just by their nature very, very hard to deal with. It's very hard to mobilize a big group of countries to tackle these problems. And so, I think there are maybe two prerequisites for success, and these are necessary but not sufficient conditions. So one would be continuing to, if you agree with the diagnosis, right, that this is a serious long-term national security problem, then it follows that it's going to take significant long-term U.S. engagement in order to fashion solutions around this issue. And the second piece of this is that it's going to require a great deal of creativity, right? Because one of the problems we face is that global warming is more of an issue for some countries than others. There are some countries who will be far more disadvantaged by steps you would take to combat global warming, or climate change rather, than others. And so you're going to have to think very creatively about how you offset gains and losses in order to get enough equity in these things that you can actually work toward a solution. I'm not sure that the history of the Cold War necessarily provides a perfect parallel, but I think if you look at previous efforts more broadly to deal with collective action problems, collective issues, you can see some parallels there. Yes, sir.
Arms control treaties, that might be an analogy that would be apt.
There are aspects of that. Non-proliferation, right? That's certainly a potential analog. The issue, well, actually, it may be a closer analog than I initially thought, in the sense that in order to have a deal on global non-proliferation, first you had to have a deal between the superpowers. Right? And so the core of the NPT was a U.S.-Soviet bargain in the mid and late 1960s that then drew in that we then worked to draw other countries into. And so if you were looking for the parallel, maybe it's the U.S.-China climate change accord of last year, and then using that as a framework to bring in other countries. It's an intriguing possibility. Yes, sir.
Sir, first, thanks for coming out today and speaking to us. Second of all, you've posited a successful grand strategy under very relatively healthy macroeconomic conditions, namely 4% of a $13 trillion economy, give or take. What does a successful grand strategy look like if we have misunderstood the macroeconomic environment that we're in? If we are not in that healthy and macroeconomic environment?
You're talking about if the United States is not going to experience robust growth over the next 10, 20 years?
Or even moderate to weak growth.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a fundamental threat to the viability of this strategy. If for no other reason than it would make it harder politically to deal with all of the issues of how we distribute resources across national programs. And so I think at the very least we're going to have weak to moderate growth over the next 10, 20 years. I'm optimistic we might get a little bit more than that. I'm not too worried about a period of prolonged stagnation. But I think, you put your finger on something important, which is that we had moments of profound economic difficulty during the Cold War. I mean, most of the 1970s were a moment of profound economic difficulty. And we managed to persist through those, although they took a toll on our international activism in the process. But if you get a period of a decade or 2 decades I think for any country that would pose a profound threat to their ability to act effectively on the international stage. Yes, sir.
I don't know the name of the author, I can't recall, but the guy that wrote The Accidental Superpower, he's kind of giving the premise that the retrenchment occurs, but the United States, due to its geographical advantages compared to other countries' geographical advantages, and the demographic projections of different countries, the United States will still be fine, even if it has a significant retrenchment future trajectory. I was wondering if you were familiar with that and what your comments were.
So, if you look at long-term indicators, demographics, economic growth, political stability, the United States stacks up fairly well against a lot of other competitors. I mean, I think that the potential problem with that argument is simply that we have thrived in an atmosphere of international stability and prosperity. U.S. global engagement has been a crucial ingredient of that stability and prosperity. If you were to remove U.S. global engagement, it's not at all evident to me that you would have the same permissive international environment that we've enjoyed over the past 70 years, more or less. And so, the question isn't necessarily would the United States cease to function as a healthy society if we had sort of a less stable, less prosperous world. The question is, would we be as secure, would we be as prosperous as we've managed to be? And so I think that parsing the question in that way is actually a bit misleading when it comes to sort of the fundamental grand strategic decision we face. It's not sort of, we are a powerful society with a lot of long-term indicators on our side, therefore we can disengage. It should be, if we are a powerful society with lots of long-term indicators on our side, we should have confidence that we can continue to play the role that we've played for the past 70 years.
Well, I don't know if you're familiar with the book or not, but he's basically saying things will fall apart in other places, but it's really not going to matter to us because we're going to be strong anyway.
Yeah, I mean, so the U.S. economy is globally integrated enough at this point that it's hard for me to see how East Asia falling apart wouldn't have an impact on the American economy. It's hard for me to see how a complete collapse of governance in a place like Mexico or Central America wouldn't impact the United States. One of the things we've learned over time is that if the geopolitical order in a place like Europe collapses, there's a significant possibility the United States will eventually be drawn in, and we'd be doing so under less favorable circumstances if we had pulled out first. And so I'm simply not sure that I share the premise that if the world went to hell, we would be fine. Perhaps that's a good place to wind. Okay.
Was a reflection of just how good Dr. Brand's talk was, and I appreciate, as I hope you did, the very incisive questions. So thank you. I'd like to present you with a coin.
Thank you very
from the
much.
Historical Office. And
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.